Queen Victoria's reign, spanning over 6 decades, stands as one of the most transformative periods in British history. From the early days of her unexpected ascension to the throne in 1837 to her death in 1901, Victoria's era witnessed a profound evolution in politics, society, culture, and global influence. The Victorian era saw Britain rise to the peak of its imperial power, the birth of modern industrial society, and the shaping of a cultural identity that would resonate through the centuries. Yet this period was also marked by deep contradictions, an age of moral certitudes and social rigidity, but also of profound social unrest and calls for reform. As we explore Queen Victoria's legacy, we not only uncover the achievements of her reign, but also confront the complexities of an empire and a society that would eventually give way to the modern world. Queen Victoria, born on May 24, 1819, is one of the most iconic monarchs in British history, known not only for her lengthy reign, but also for her profound impact on the culture, politics, and structure of the British Empire. Ascending to the throne at the age of 18, following the death of her uncle, King William IV, Victoria's reign spanned 63 years and 216 days, making her the longest-reigning British monarch until Queen Elizabeth II surpassed her in 2015. This era, known as the Victorian Age, was marked by significant transformation, both in the British Isles and across the globe, driven by industrialization, imperial expansion, and social reform. Queen Victoria's personal life, however, was deeply entwined with the development of her monarchy and her nation's direction. The Victorian era, beginning in 1837 and ending with Queen Victoria's death in 1901, was a period of great change. It was a time when the United Kingdom rose to unprecedented heights of political and economic power, becoming the center of a vast global empire that spanned continents. The British Empire, by the end of the 19th century, controlled vast territories, and the empire's influence was seen in almost every corner of the globe. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun earlier in the century, reached its zenith during her reign, transforming Britain from a primarily agrarian society to the world's industrial and technological leader. Innovations such as the steam engine, the telegraph, and the railway revolutionized life, driving growth, expansion, and urbanization. In politics, the Victorian period witnessed profound reforms, including the extension of suffrage and significant changes in labor laws, which shaped modern democratic and social structures. Despite her own personal conservatism, Queen Victoria played a pivotal role in the gradual shift from a monarch with real political power to one who symbolized unity and stability, serving as a figurehead during the growth of the British constitutional monarchy. The monarch's influence during this time was more in terms of the moral and cultural authority she held than in direct governance, as the British political system became increasingly parliamentary. Queen Victoria's role in shaping both the empire and the monarchy cannot be overstated. Her personal values, including a strong sense of duty, modesty, and moral propriety, set the tone for the era and resonated throughout British society. Her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840, a union that was both a love match and a political alliance, played a critical role in the modernization of the monarchy. Prince Albert, an intellectual and reformist, helped guide the Queen and the royal family towards adopting more modern, progressive stances on social issues and governance. Their relationship also brought a more personal and familial element to the monarchy, which had previously been seen as distant and disconnected from the people. The Victorian era was also marked by profound social changes, many of which had their roots in Queen Victoria's own reign. Social reforms in the areas of child labor, education, public health, and women's rights began to take shape, influenced in part by the changing social landscape created by industrialization. The growth of cities, as people flocked to urban areas for work in factories, created new challenges related to housing, sanitation, and public health. The rise of the middle class, often referred to as the Victorian middle class, was another defining characteristic of this period. The Victorian middle class placed a high value on propriety, social status, and respectability, and Queen Victoria embodied these values, earning her the title of the epitome of Victorian morality. Queen Victoria's personal life, however, was deeply entwined with the nation's story. Born into the House of Hanover as Victoria Alexandrina, she was the daughter of Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Her father's untimely death in 1820, when she was only a year old, placed her in a precarious position. As the only surviving legitimate child of the Duke, she became the heir presumptive to the British throne, a title that made her future reign uncertain and complicated by political intrigue within the royal family. Her early years were marked by her mother's intense and sometimes overbearing influence. Princess Victoria, a German princess, was a strict and dominating presence in the young queen's life, instilling a sense of discipline and duty, but also sheltering her from the larger world of politics and court life. Queen Victoria's upbringing was sheltered, primarily by her mother, who ensured that her daughter's education focused on propriety and a sense of moral responsibility. The queen's early education was managed by a series of tutors, with an emphasis on subjects such as languages, history, and literature. She was taught French and German, as well as the Bible and moral philosophy. Though her education was conventional, Queen Victoria was deeply intelligent and highly self-disciplined, qualities that would later define her reign. Her early introduction to politics and royal duties occurred after her father's death and throughout her childhood, as her mother gradually prepared her for the role of monarch. When Queen Victoria ascended to the throne at just 18 years old, it was a period of political instability. The Whigs, the dominant political party, were in power, and there was uncertainty about how a young, inexperienced queen would manage the role. Queen Victoria was keenly aware of her responsibility and worked diligently to learn the intricacies of her position. Her first major political engagement was with Lord Melbourne, who was appointed her prime minister. Melbourne became a trusted advisor to the young queen and played an instrumental role in guiding her through the complex world of governance. The challenges she faced early on were numerous. As a young woman without the experience of reigning over a nation, Queen Victoria was thrust into a world of political maneuvering, courtly expectations, and royal duties. Yet, her natural intelligence, keen sense of duty, and desire to serve her people helped her rise to the challenge. She grew from a shy, uncertain teenager into a resolute and determined monarch who would go on to influence not only Britain but the entire world. The death of her father, Prince Edward, in 1820, when Queen Victoria was just a year old, was the defining event of her early life. With the death of her father, the line of succession became a crucial issue, and the future of the British monarchy became uncertain. Her mother, Princess Victoria, took charge of her upbringing, raising her in an environment that shielded her from the political intrigue surrounding her potential accession. Despite being isolated, Queen Victoria's education was thorough, and she was well prepared to take on her future role as monarch. It was in this atmosphere that Victoria grew up, eventually becoming a queen who would witness and drive immense societal change. While she may have been initially sheltered from the full weight of her future role, the circumstances of her early life provided the foundation for her eventual success. Despite the difficulties she faced growing up, Queen Victoria's education and upbringing, combined with her natural intelligence and sense of duty, allowed her to navigate the complexities of monarchy and lead Britain into an era of unprecedented growth and influence. Her childhood and early life were marked by both tragedy and the promise of greatness, with the death of her father setting the stage for a future that was uncertain but filled with promise. The influence of her mother, the guidance of advisors like Lord Melbourne, and the love and partnership with Prince Albert, her husband, would shape her reign and define the legacy of the Victorian era. Queen Victoria's accession to the throne in 1837 was an event that marked the beginning of an era that would shape not only British history, but also the world. Born as Victoria Alexandrina, she was thrust into power at the age of 18, following the death of her uncle, King William IV. The circumstances surrounding her ascension were not without complication, as she found herself inheriting a nation fraught with political instability and challenges. Despite being a young, inexperienced monarch, Queen Victoria would rise to the occasion, navigating the turbulent waters of politics, courtly expectations, and personal trials. When William IV passed away in June 1837, Queen Victoria became the heir to the British throne, despite being the daughter of the Duke of Kent, who had been the fourth son of King George III. As a woman, her ascension was not guaranteed. The line of succession had been a contentious issue, and there were many who doubted the ability of a young woman to rule. Some, including her own family members, had hoped that her cousin, Prince Ernest of Saxe-Coburg, would inherit the throne. However, the sudden death of her uncle left Victoria with no alternative. Upon hearing the news, Victoria was thrust into the role of queen at a time of political and social change, with no time to prepare for the weight of the responsibilities she was now tasked with. Victoria's early reign was marked by the steep learning curve that came with being a young, untested monarch. At just 18, she was inexperienced in the political workings of the royal court and the intricacies of governance. Her youth, coupled with the lack of formal education in statecraft, meant that she had to learn the ropes quickly and rely on her advisors, most notably Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister at the time. Lord Melbourne, an experienced politician, played a pivotal role in guiding the young queen through her early days of rule. His calm and experienced demeanor, combined with his knowledge of politics, allowed him to earn Victoria's trust, becoming both her political advisor and a confidant. Her relationship with Lord Melbourne was more than just that of a monarch and her prime minister. It was one of deep personal affection. Queen Victoria would later describe him as her dear friend, and their bond grew stronger over time. Melbourne's advice was instrumental in helping the Queen navigate the political landscape, and he was crucial in shaping her early policies. However, their relationship also faced challenges, as the Prime Minister's influence led to public speculation about the nature of their relationship. Some saw Melbourne as a surrogate father figure to Victoria, while others questioned the propriety of their closeness. Despite this, Victoria remained deeply reliant on Melbourne's guidance, and he was the first of many prime ministers she would come to work with during her reign. While Lord Melbourne's advice helped stabilize the early years of her reign, Queen Victoria faced significant challenges in her relationship with her family, particularly with her uncles. The royal family was often divided in its loyalties and interests, and this created tensions within the court. The Regency Act, which had been passed earlier to provide for a regent in case a monarch was unable to rule, further complicated her position as a female monarch. There were many who questioned whether a woman could effectively rule, especially in such a turbulent political landscape. This legislation had implications not just for her immediate family, but also for her role as a ruler. The Regency Act, which was established to allow a regent to govern on behalf of the monarch in the event of incapacity or minority, was a reflection of the times and attitudes towards women in power. In the 19th century, many believed that women were ill-suited for leadership roles, and Queen Victoria's ascension brought these biases to the forefront. It was, therefore, a significant challenge for the young queen to assert her authority, especially in an environment where her every move was scrutinized, and her ability to govern was doubted by some of her own family members. Despite these challenges, Victoria was determined to prove herself as a capable ruler. She took her responsibilities seriously, and her early reign was marked by her commitment to learning about the state's affairs. While she lacked the experience of her predecessors, she was intelligent and intuitive, quickly absorbing the complexities of governance and learning the necessary skills to rule. Her early political struggles were not just about understanding the intricacies of the British Constitution, but also about establishing her position as queen. Her ability to navigate through these early years was a testament to her strength of character, and she soon emerged as a powerful force in British politics. Her relationship with Lord Melbourne, however, was not without complications. While their bond was strong, Victoria was not blind to the political maneuvering that took place around her. She understood that, as a monarch, she had to balance the demands of her prime minister with the expectations of her subjects. Victoria began to question some of Melbourne's policies, particularly his approach to foreign affairs, and by 1841, she found herself at odds with him on several issues. Despite their differences, Melbourne remained a trusted advisor to Victoria, and their professional relationship continued to evolve throughout her reign. Amidst her political struggles and personal uncertainties, Queen Victoria found solace in her marriage to Prince Albert. The proposal and marriage to Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840 would have profound implications, not only for Victoria's personal life, but also for her reign. Prince Albert was more than just a consort. He was a confidant, advisor, and partner in every sense. Albert's intelligence, work ethic, and strong sense of duty complemented Victoria's own sense of responsibility, and together, they formed a powerful partnership that would shape the course of the monarchy. Prince Albert's influence on Queen Victoria was significant, both personally and politically. He encouraged her to take a more active role in shaping policy, particularly in areas related to industry, education, and social reform. Albert shared Victoria's desire to modernize the monarchy, and their collaboration on matters of state and personal life brought about significant changes. Albert's focus on the family unit also had a profound impact on the Queen, and their shared devotion to their children created a sense of stability in the royal household. The royal couple's family life was not without challenges. They had 9 children, and the demands of raising a large family while managing a vast empire were not easy. Despite these pressures, Victoria and Albert remained deeply committed to one another and worked together to provide stability for their family and the monarchy. Victoria's relationship with Albert, particularly after his untimely death in 1861, would have lasting effects on her emotional well-being and her role as queen. Albert's death left Victoria devastated, and she wore mourning clothes for the remainder of her life. The loss of her beloved husband marked the beginning of a period of deep mourning and personal isolation for Victoria, but it also reinforced her determination to continue her duties as queen, honoring Albert's memory by focusing on the advancement of the monarchy and the empire. In conclusion, Queen Victoria's early reign was marked by both personal and political challenges. From the moment she ascended to the throne, she faced immense pressure as a young, inexperienced monarch. However, through her relationship with Lord Melbourne and her eventual marriage to Prince Albert, Victoria found guidance and support that allowed her to grow into a capable and determined ruler. Together, she and Prince Albert modernized the monarchy, and their partnership not only shaped the Victorian era but also set the stage for the future of the British royal family. The early years of Victoria's reign laid the groundwork for the transformation of the British monarchy and the legacy she would leave behind. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, was a time of extraordinary social, political, and cultural transformation in Britain. Queen Victoria's reign witnessed a complex society marked by rigid class divisions, an emerging middle class, profound shifts in social and moral values, significant advancements in art and literature, and groundbreaking intellectual developments. These changes were deeply interconnected with the rapid expansion of industrialism, the growth of the British Empire, and the far-reaching effects of religious and philosophical movements. The era's unique characteristics also shaped the role of women and children, influencing both their societal roles and their rights. This chapter will explore the social fabric of Victorian society, examining class divisions, Victorian morality, cultural outputs in art and literature, as well as developments in education and child welfare. Victorian society was characterized by a rigid class system that dictated one's place in the social hierarchy. At the top of this hierarchy was the aristocracy and landed gentry, the traditional elite, whose wealth came primarily from land ownership. This class was made up of nobles, baronets, and landowners who often held positions of political power, such as members of parliament, and enjoyed privileged lifestyles. Beneath them were the upper middle class, composed of professionals like lawyers, doctors, and businessmen. The upper middle class wielded considerable influence and were key players in the growing industrial economy. The lower middle class emerged as a distinct group during the Victorian era. As industrialization took root, skilled workers, shopkeepers, and clerks began to gain economic stability and upward mobility. They represented a new force in Victorian society, benefiting from the growth of factories, commerce, and trade. Although still far from the wealth of the upper classes, this growing group of professionals and small business owners found ways to influence the development of the economy and social structures. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the working classes, including both skilled laborers and the unskilled poor. For these individuals, life in Victorian Britain was difficult, and their opportunities for upward mobility were limited. Factory workers, miners, and laborers lived in harsh conditions, facing long hours, low wages, and dangerous work environments. The rapid expansion of industrialization contributed to the growth of urban centers, but the conditions in these growing cities were often overcrowded and unsanitary. Poverty was widespread among the working class, and despite their hard work, they struggled to gain any meaningful political power or social recognition. Women, regardless of class, were largely confined to the private sphere, with their roles limited to home and family. The concept of separate spheres defined the Victorian attitude toward gender roles, where men were expected to work in the public sphere while women were expected to maintain the domestic sphere. Women's limited rights, particularly in terms of property ownership, education, and legal status, reflected their subordinate position within society. The Victorian era was also a time when the concept of angel in the house prevailed. Women were expected to embody purity, modesty, and devotion to their husbands and children. The rise of industrialism had a significant impact on class divisions, as it created a larger and more complex social structure. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun earlier in the century, gathered momentum during Victoria's reign. The development of factories and the growth of urban centers led to the mass migration of people from rural areas to cities in search of work. The explosion of factory jobs provided many with employment, but it also led to the exploitation of workers, particularly women and children. The industrialization of Britain expanded the middle class, but it also deepened the divide between the wealthy and the working poor. The expansion of the British Empire played a crucial role in shaping Victorian society. During this period, the British Empire reached its zenith, encompassing vast territories in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. The empire's growth fueled Britain's economic prosperity and bolstered its global influence, but it also led to exploitation, oppression, and the displacement of indigenous populations. The empire was a source of pride for many Britons, and its colonies contributed to the wealth and power of the Victorian state. However, the imperial project also brought complex moral questions to the forefront, particularly regarding the treatment of colonized peoples and the ethics of British intervention. Victorian morality became a defining feature of the period, influencing social norms, expectations, and personal behavior. The concept of Victorian morality was deeply rooted in conservative and religious values, with an emphasis on modesty, respectability, and self-discipline. In many ways, Victorian morality reflected the desire to maintain social order in a rapidly changing society. The strict codes of behavior encompassed everything from personal appearance and manners to marriage and family life. The ideals of chastity, sobriety, and propriety governed social interactions, particularly for women. The emphasis on family values was another cornerstone of Victorian morality. The family was seen as the basic unit of society, and its preservation was a primary concern. The Victorian middle class, in particular, placed a high value on the role of women as wives and mothers. Women were expected to embody the ideal of domesticity and take on the role of moral guardian of the household. This idealized image of the Victorian family was closely tied to religious teachings, particularly evangelical Christianity, which promoted the sanctity of marriage and the importance of familial ties. Religion played a significant role in shaping Victorian values, with Christianity being at the center of societal life. Evangelicalism, a movement within Protestantism that emphasized personal salvation, moral righteousness, and social reform, had a profound influence on Victorian society. Evangelical Christians were particularly active in charitable work and reform movements, advocating for the abolition of slavery, the improvement of working conditions, and the expansion of education. The Church of England also maintained a strong presence in public life, though its influence began to decline as other Christian denominations, such as Methodism and Catholicism, gained followers. Victorian society's obsession with morality often resulted in a double standard, especially when it came to issues such as sexuality. While the period is often associated with prudishness and sexual repression, there was also a significant undercurrent of hypocrisy. Prostitution, infidelity, and extramarital affairs were common, despite the prevailing moral codes. The contrast between public morality and private behavior would become a central theme in the literature of the time, with authors like Charles Dickens and George Eliot exploring the gaps between idealized morality and the complexities of human behavior. The Victorian era was a period of immense creativity in the arts and literature. This was the age of some of Britain's greatest writers, whose works addressed pressing social issues and examined the human condition in new ways. Charles Dickens, for example, was a keen observer of the hardships of Victorian life, particularly for the poor. His novels, such as Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, highlighted issues like child labor, poverty, and the impact of industrialization on society. Similarly, George Eliot, the pen name of Marian Evans, was a groundbreaking novelist whose works, including Middlemarch, examined social and moral dilemmas in a rapidly changing society. The Brontë sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, were also pivotal figures in Victorian literature. Their novels, particularly Jane Eyre by Charlotte and Wuthering Heights by Emily, explored themes of passion, rebellion, and the limitations imposed on women by society. These works broke with traditional Victorian norms and presented complex, often unconventional characters who defied societal expectations. Victorian literature was not only a reflection of the times, but also a tool for social change. Writers used their works to critique the injustices of society, particularly the treatment of the poor, women, and children. The social problems of the era were explored through vivid storytelling and character development, making literature a vehicle for public discourse and reform. In art, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood emerged as an important movement during the mid-19th century. Founded by artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and William Holman Hunt, the Brotherhood sought to reject the academic standards of the Royal Academy and return to the vivid colors, intricate details, and emotional intensity of earlier Italian painters before Raphael. Their work often depicted idealized versions of nature, mythology, and literature, with an emphasis on beauty and emotional depth. Intellectual movements in philosophy and science also played a significant role in shaping Victorian culture. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, first published in On the Origin of Species in 1859, had a profound impact on Victorian thought, challenging traditional religious views of creation and sparking debates that continue to this day. Darwin's ideas would eventually lead to a shift in the way people thought about humanity's place in the world, influencing everything from theology to social policy. The rise of social sciences, including sociology and psychology, was another intellectual development of the era. Thinkers like Auguste Comte, John Stuart Mill, and Herbert Spencer began to explore the structures of society, the nature of individual freedom, and the role of government in promoting social welfare. These ideas would lay the foundation for many of the social reforms that would take place in the late Victorian period. Education became a central issue during the Victorian era, as literacy rates began to rise and the importance of public education became more widely recognized. The development of schools and the push for universal education were driven by a combination of industrial necessity and social reform. The growing need for skilled workers in factories and offices created a demand for education, while social reformers like Thomas Arnold and Samuel Smiles advocated for the moral and intellectual development of the working class. The establishment of public schools, such as the board schools, played a crucial role in spreading literacy and improving education. By the end of the 19th century, a significant proportion of children were receiving formal education, although it was still primarily focused on basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, with less emphasis on critical thinking or creativity. Child welfare became another significant concern during the Victorian era, as the exploitation of children in factories and mines came under increasing scrutiny. Reformers such as Lord Shaftesbury campaigned for the abolition of child labor and the implementation of child protection laws. The Factory Acts, passed in the mid-19th century, aimed to regulate working hours and conditions for children, though enforcement remained a challenge. Victorian society was shaped by a complex web of social, cultural, and intellectual forces. The rigid class system, the moral values of the era, the flourishing of art and literature, and the rise of industrialization all played a part in defining the Victorian experience. At the same time, the era was marked by significant social reforms, including improvements in education and child welfare. Although the period was often characterized by conservatism and moral rigidity, it was also a time of profound change and cultural achievement, laying the groundwork for many of the social and political developments that would follow in the 20th century. During Queen Victoria's long reign from 1837 to 1901, the political landscape of Britain experienced significant transformation, as the country transitioned from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional one. Queen Victoria's role as a monarch during this era was marked by the shifting balance of power between the monarchy, Parliament, and the Prime Ministers. This chapter will explore the evolution of the British political system, the key political figures and their influence, the rise of imperialism, and the numerous reform movements that shaped the Victorian era. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, Britain was already a constitutional monarchy, where the powers of the monarch were severely limited by law, and the parliamentary system had taken on the dominant role in governance. The British Constitution, though unwritten, had evolved over centuries to gradually shift power from the monarchy to elected representatives. At the start of the Victorian era, the monarchy's role was largely ceremonial, with political decisions and legislative power residing with the Prime Minister and Parliament. Queen Victoria's reign witnessed the further evolution of this constitutional monarchy, marked by the increasing importance of Parliament and the decline of royal influence in governance. One of the defining features of her reign was her relationship with her prime ministers. Queen Victoria's personal involvement in politics, while not as overt as some monarchs, was still significant. She had strong opinions on political matters and often sought to influence the course of political events. However, she was careful not to overstep the boundaries of her constitutional role, understanding that any assertion of royal power outside her ceremonial duties would threaten the delicate balance between monarchy and government. The relationship between the monarchy and the elected government during the Victorian era was guided by constitutional conventions, most notably the idea that the monarch's authority should not override the will of Parliament. Despite this, Queen Victoria played an active role in selecting prime ministers, often influenced by her personal connections and opinions. One of the most important ways in which Queen Victoria influenced political life was through her relationships with her prime ministers, especially Lord Melbourne, Sir Robert Peel, William Gladstone, and Benjamin Disraeli. Queen Victoria's political power was further constrained by the development of political parties and the emergence of the modern parliamentary system. The Reform Acts of the 19th century, particularly the Reform Act of 1832, were pivotal in expanding suffrage and changing the political landscape. These reforms gradually expanded voting rights, particularly among the middle class, and strengthened the role of Parliament as the primary governing body of the nation. The Reform Acts, which extended the franchise to a broader segment of the population, also marked the growing importance of political parties. The early part of Queen Victoria's reign saw the gradual development of the Liberal and Conservative parties, which would come to dominate British politics. By the time of Queen Victoria's death, these two parties had established the framework for the modern British political system, and their rivalry would define British politics for much of the 20th century. Queen Victoria's relationship with her prime ministers played a central role in shaping the political landscape of the Victorian era. One of the most significant prime ministers during her reign was Lord Melbourne, who served as her advisor and confidant during the early years of her reign. Lord Melbourne was a Liberal, and his tenure was marked by a close relationship with the Queen, who came to trust his counsel. Despite the fact that Lord Melbourne was the leader of the Whig Party, the precursor to the Liberal Party, he understood the delicate position of the monarchy and worked to ensure that Queen Victoria remained politically neutral. Lord Melbourne's influence on Queen Victoria was profound, and his advice helped shape her understanding of constitutional monarchy. During the early part of her reign, Queen Victoria was a young and inexperienced monarch, and Melbourne's guidance was crucial in helping her navigate the complexities of British politics. Queen Victoria's trust in him was evident, and their relationship remained strong throughout her reign. However, not all of Queen Victoria's relationships with her prime ministers were as harmonious. One of the most dramatic political conflicts of her reign occurred with Sir Robert Peel, a Conservative prime minister. Queen Victoria had initially found Sir Robert Peel to be an effective and capable leader, but their relationship soured over the issue of the Corn Laws, a set of tariffs on imported grain. Peel's decision to repeal the Corn Laws in 1846, which went against the Queen's own views, caused a rift between them. Despite their personal differences, Peel's decision to prioritize national interest over royal opinion reflected the growing influence of elected officials over royal prerogative. Queen Victoria's relationship with William Gladstone, the leader of the Liberal Party, was another significant feature of her reign. Gladstone, a deeply religious and reform-minded politician, had a complex and sometimes strained relationship with the Queen. They disagreed on several key issues, most notably in relation to the Irish question. Gladstone was a staunch advocate for Irish Home Rule, which was strongly opposed by Queen Victoria, who believed that Ireland should remain firmly under British control. Despite their political differences, Queen Victoria respected Gladstone's dedication to public service, and he became one of her longest-serving prime ministers. Benjamin Disraeli, the leader of the Conservative Party, represented another pivotal figure in Victorian politics. Disraeli's relationship with Queen Victoria was notably more cordial than that of Gladstone. Disraeli, a charismatic and ambitious politician, recognized the importance of the monarchy and worked to cultivate a close relationship with the Queen. His policies were often seen as more favorable to the interests of the aristocracy, and he championed imperial expansion, which found favor with Queen Victoria. Disraeli's political career, particularly his role in the Conservative Party and his work on behalf of the British Empire, aligned well with Queen Victoria's vision of Britain as a global power. Throughout her reign, Queen Victoria's political influence, while constrained by the constitutional system, was not insignificant. She wielded considerable power behind the scenes, particularly in her relationships with her prime ministers. Her influence on the selection of key political figures and her ability to shape political discourse during her reign cannot be underestimated. The height of the British Empire coincided with the Victorian era, and the expansion of British imperialism was one of the defining features of Queen Victoria's reign. The Victorian period saw Britain become the most powerful empire in the world, controlling vast territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. This period of imperial expansion was driven by a combination of economic, strategic, and ideological motivations. One of the key drivers of imperialism during the Victorian era was the desire for economic gain. The expansion of the British Empire allowed for the exploitation of natural resources and the creation of new markets for British goods. This was particularly evident in Africa, where British colonial policies sought to control key territories for the extraction of valuable minerals and the establishment of profitable trade routes. In India, British colonial rule was marked by the exploitation of local resources and the imposition of British economic and political systems. The scramble for Africa, which occurred in the late 19th century, saw European powers competing for control of African territories. The British Empire played a prominent role in this scramble, with Queen Victoria presiding over the annexation of vast swaths of land across the continent. British colonial policies in Africa were often marked by violence, exploitation, and the suppression of indigenous cultures. However, imperialists justified these actions through the rhetoric of the civilizing mission, which portrayed British rule as bringing progress and civilization to supposedly backward societies. Queen Victoria's role as Empress of India was another defining aspect of her imperial reign. In 1876, Queen Victoria was formally proclaimed Empress of India, symbolizing the consolidation of British control over the subcontinent. India became a key part of the British Empire, providing valuable resources such as cotton, tea, and spices. Queen Victoria's relationship with India was largely symbolic, but it reflected the deep connection between the monarchy and the empire. The British Crown's role in India was central to the maintenance of imperial power, and Queen Victoria was seen as the figurehead of British rule in India. The Victorian era was also marked by significant social and political reform movements, many of which were driven by public discontent with the prevailing social order. These reform movements sought to address issues such as poverty, labor rights, women's suffrage, and political representation. One of the most important reform movements of the 19th century was Chartism, a working-class movement that sought to expand suffrage and improve the political representation of ordinary people. The Chartists, who were primarily composed of working men, advocated for a range of democratic reforms, including universal male suffrage, equal electoral districts, and the secret ballot. Although the Chartists did not achieve their goals during the Victorian era, their movement helped lay the groundwork for future electoral reforms, including the extension of the franchise through the Reform Acts. Women's suffrage was another key issue in Victorian politics, and the campaign for women's rights gained momentum during Queen Victoria's reign. The suffrage movement, led by figures such as Emmeline Pankhurst and Millicent Fawcett, sought to secure voting rights for women. Although women would not gain the right to vote until after Queen Victoria's death, the suffrage movement played a critical role in challenging the gender norms and legal restrictions that limited women's roles in society. Labor rights were another significant issue during the Victorian period, as industrialization and urbanization led to the exploitation of workers, particularly in factories and mines. The rise of trade unions and the push for labor reforms were critical aspects of the Victorian reform agenda. The Factory Acts, which regulated child labor and working hours, were among the first steps toward improving the conditions of workers in industrial Britain. The political changes driven by economic crises, wars, and public discontent during the Victorian era were key factors in shaping the political landscape of the time. Queen Victoria's reign witnessed the expansion of suffrage, the growth of the welfare state, and the rise of labor rights and women's rights movements. These reforms were a testament to the dynamic nature of Victorian politics and the ongoing struggle for social justice. The Victorian era was a period of significant political transformation. The evolution of the British political system, the changing balance of power between the monarchy, parliament, and prime ministers, and the rise of imperialism were defining features of Queen Victoria's reign. The political landscape was shaped by the rise of political parties, the expansion of suffrage, and the emergence of key political figures who influenced the course of British history. The era also saw the height of British imperial power, with the empire expanding into Africa, India, and the Pacific. Reform movements in labor rights, women's suffrage, and social justice laid the foundation for many of the social and political changes that would follow in the 20th century. Queen Victoria's reign was marked by the tension between tradition and progress, and her legacy continues to shape the political landscape of modern Britain. Queen Victoria's personal life, particularly her relationships with her family, was central to her identity and reign. She maintained a highly structured and traditional view of family life, yet her family relationships also had significant political ramifications. The royal family during the Victorian era was intricately linked with European diplomacy, as many of Queen Victoria's children married into various royal houses, forming a network of political alliances. This chapter delves into Queen Victoria's family, her relationship with her beloved consort Prince Albert, and the profound impact these relationships had on her personal life and on the broader political landscape of Europe. Queen Victoria had 9 children, and through their marriages, she became known as the grandmother of Europe. Her children were married into the royal families of Germany, Russia, Denmark, and other parts of Europe, creating a network of interconnected monarchies that would play a significant role in European diplomacy for decades. Her children were Victoria, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, Beatrice, and the heir to the throne Albert Edward, later King Edward VII. Each of these children had a crucial role to play in the family's political and dynastic strategy. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert carefully selected their children's spouses, often with an eye towards strengthening the British monarchy's position in Europe. The marriages were arranged to secure political alliances, peace treaties, and strengthen the ties between Britain and its continental neighbors. Victoria's eldest daughter, Princess Victoria, married Prince Frederick William of Prussia, who would later become the German emperor. This marriage was a significant one for the future of Europe, as it connected the British royal family with the powerful German monarchy. Her second daughter, Princess Alice, married Louis of Hesse, a union that helped maintain strong ties with Germany. Her eldest son, Alfred, married the Grand Duchess Marie of Russia, further strengthening the British connection with Russia. Queen Victoria's fourth daughter, Princess Helena, married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, while her fifth daughter, Princess Louise, married John Campbell, the Marquis of Lorne, in a more unconventional match, as he was not of royal blood. Princess Arthur married the Duchess of Edinburgh, while Leopold, the youngest son, married the Princess of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The political alliances formed through these marriages were pivotal in shaping European diplomacy throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These alliances were designed to secure Britain's position as the preeminent power in Europe and to create a web of relationships that could ensure peace. Queen Victoria's children were central to these alliances, and her role as a mother and matriarch was key to maintaining the unity of the royal family. However, despite the political advantages that these marriages brought, Queen Victoria faced significant challenges as a mother. Raising 9 children while fulfilling her duties as queen was no easy task. She had a strict and somewhat authoritarian approach to parenting, ensuring that her children adhered to the highest moral standards and royal expectations. Yet, her strictness was tempered by a deep affection for her children, and she was fiercely protective of them. The queen's maternal instincts often clashed with the demands of public life, and her children's upbringing, while royal, was also shaped by the values of discipline and duty instilled by their mother. Despite her royal duties, Queen Victoria's family life was a source of great personal fulfillment. She valued her home life and sought to create a stable, loving environment for her children. In many ways, her family life was a refuge from the pressures of her public role as queen. The royal family at Windsor Castle was marked by a sense of domestic order and Victorian propriety, with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert at the center, overseeing a household that was both a political entity and a deeply private family unit. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's beloved consort, played an incredibly important role in both the royal family and British politics. He was not simply the Queen's husband, but also her closest advisor, confidant, and co-ruler. Although his role as consort was often circumscribed by the nature of the monarchy, he had no official political power. He exerted significant influence over both domestic and foreign affairs. Prince Albert's contributions to the British royal family were profound. His marriage to Queen Victoria in 1840 was not only a personal union, but also a political alliance. Prince Albert came from the ducal house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in Germany, and his marriage to Queen Victoria strengthened the royal family's ties with the German-speaking world. Prince Albert was highly intellectual and deeply invested in the modernization of the monarchy, advocating for reforms that would improve the royal family's public image and relevance in an increasingly democratic society. Prince Albert's influence on the monarchy extended to its image. He was instrumental in transforming the royal family's public persona, emphasizing the family's role as a symbol of domestic virtue and propriety. His efforts to revamp the royal household, particularly in terms of its architectural style and organization, reflected his belief in the importance of family values and order. As consort, he also took a keen interest in the royal children's education, ensuring they were raised with a sense of duty and discipline. Despite being a foreign prince, Albert's influence extended beyond the family and into the realm of politics. Queen Victoria, particularly in the early years of her reign, relied on Prince Albert for counsel on political matters. He became a trusted advisor, particularly in matters of diplomacy, and his counsel was valued by Queen Victoria as she navigated the complexities of British politics. Albert's diplomatic acumen was crucial during the early years of Queen Victoria's reign, especially during the political crises that arose within the British government and the broader European context. However, Prince Albert's influence was not without its challenges. His strong opinions sometimes put him at odds with the royal family and court, particularly as his role was one of advisory rather than authoritative power. His sometimes strained relationships with prominent figures in Britain's political landscape, especially the prime ministers, were complicated by his foreign origins and his status as a consort rather than a reigning monarch. Prince Albert's untimely death in 1861 marked a profound turning point in Queen Victoria's life and reign. The loss of her beloved husband devastated the Queen, who went into a prolonged period of mourning. For years after his death, Queen Victoria withdrew from public life, wearing black for the remainder of her life and retreating into a private world of grief. Her mourning was not just a personal sorrow, but also an indication of how deeply Prince Albert had influenced her role as monarch. His death left an irreplaceable void in her life, and it marked the end of an era of close political and personal collaboration between the royal consort and the monarch. Prince Albert's death also had a lasting impact on the royal family. Queen Victoria, already a devoted mother, became even more protective of her children, particularly her eldest son, Albert Edward, who would eventually become King Edward VII. The emotional impact of Albert's death on Queen Victoria was significant, and it had a lasting effect on her reign and the royal family's public image. In the years following Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria became more withdrawn from public life. Her mourning and seclusion were in many ways a reflection of her grief, but they also underscored the changing role of the monarchy in British society. By the time Queen Victoria reached her later years, the monarchy had become a more symbolic institution, with political power resting firmly in the hands of the prime ministers and parliament. Queen Victoria's seclusion did not mean the end of her influence, however. Her role as monarch continued, and despite her personal grief, she remained the figurehead of the British Empire. Her children, particularly her eldest son Edward, began to take on more public responsibilities, representing the monarchy in various official capacities. By the time of her death in 1901, Queen Victoria had become the grandmother of Europe, with her children's marriages having intertwined the British royal family with nearly every other European royal house. Her legacy was marked not only by her political influence, but also by the enduring connections she had established between Britain and the rest of Europe. Queen Victoria's descendants, including her son Edward VII, would play crucial roles in shaping the course of European history, particularly in the years leading up to the First World War. Queen Victoria's later years were also marked by her role as a matriarch in a time of growing political instability. Her grandchildren, many of whom would become monarchs of various European countries, were caught up in the tensions and conflicts of early 20th century Europe. Queen Victoria's influence was still felt, even as the royal families she had united through her children's marriages found themselves embroiled in the complexities of the political and military alliances that ultimately led to the First World War. Queen Victoria's family and personal life were foundational to her reign and legacy. Through her 9 children and their strategic marriages, Queen Victoria was able to solidify her family's place at the center of European diplomacy. The role of Prince Albert as consort and advisor was instrumental in shaping both her personal life and the monarchy's public image. The Queen's mourning after his death and her subsequent seclusion marked a poignant chapter in her later years. As the grandmother of Europe's royal families, Queen Victoria's influence continued to be felt throughout the 20th century, with her family members playing pivotal roles in the shaping of modern Europe. The Victorian era is synonymous with the Industrial Revolution, an era that profoundly reshaped Britain and the wider world. The transformative changes that took place in the economy, social structure, and technological advancements during this period laid the groundwork for the modern world. The industrial landscape of Britain during the Victorian period was marked by innovations in manufacturing, transportation, and communication that led to unprecedented economic growth. However, these advancements came with significant social and economic challenges, which shaped the lives of millions, particularly the working class. This chapter explores the profound impact of the Industrial Revolution on Britain's economy, the economic growth and wealth it generated, and the darker side of industrialization that brought about significant changes in the class structure and urban living conditions. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century and gained momentum in the early 19th century, brought about the most significant economic and social transformation Britain had ever witnessed. It marked a shift from an agrarian economy based on small-scale farming and handicrafts to one dominated by industrial manufacturing. A combination of new technologies, access to raw materials, innovations in transportation, and capital investment laid the foundations for rapid industrialization. Central to this transformation was the development of steam power, particularly in the form of steam engines that powered machinery, trains, and ships. The textile industry was one of the first sectors to benefit from mechanization. Inventions such as the spinning jenny, the power loom, and the steam-powered cotton mill enabled mass production on an unprecedented scale. These innovations allowed Britain to manufacture goods faster and more cheaply than ever before, enabling the country to become the world's leading industrial power by the mid-19th century. The rise of factories fueled by steam power drastically changed the way goods were produced. Before the Industrial Revolution, goods were typically made in small workshops or homes, often by artisans or skilled laborers. The factory system, however, centralized production in large-scale facilities where unskilled workers could operate machines. The factory system also increased the division of labor, allowing workers to specialize in specific tasks, leading to increased efficiency and productivity. This transformation extended beyond the textile industry, with the iron and steel industries seeing similarly transformative changes in their methods of production. In addition to technological advancements, the Industrial Revolution also brought significant social changes. The most noticeable change was urbanization. As factories sprang up, people moved from rural areas to urban centers in search of work. Cities such as London, Manchester, and Liverpool exploded in size, and by the mid-19th century, Britain had become the world's first urbanized nation. The migration from rural areas to cities was driven by the promise of employment in factories, but it also meant that people were uprooted from traditional agricultural work and rural lifestyles, leading to a complete transformation of the country's social fabric. Urbanization also contributed to the rapid growth of cities, particularly in the industrial north of England. Manchester, which became the epitome of industrialization, grew from a small market town into a major industrial city during the Victorian period. It became the world's first industrial city, largely due to its central role in the cotton industry. Other cities like Liverpool and Birmingham also saw similar growth, driven by the demand for industrial labor and the expansion of the railway network. The Industrial Revolution resulted in a period of remarkable economic growth for Britain, making it the preeminent global economic power of the 19th century. The boom in trade and commerce, spurred by industrialization, solidified Britain's position as the workshop of the world. As manufacturing increased, so did the demand for raw materials such as cotton, coal, iron, and wool, many of which were imported from Britain's colonies around the globe. The vast expansion of the British Empire provided the raw materials and markets needed to fuel the industrial machine, while British ships and railways facilitated the global exchange of goods. The rise of the railways was a key element in the economic transformation during the Victorian era. The development of the railway network revolutionized transportation, enabling the movement of goods and people at unprecedented speeds. By the mid-19th century, the railway network covered much of Britain, linking industrial centers to ports, markets, and raw material sources. The expansion of railways also allowed for greater access to the countryside, transforming rural life and creating new markets for agricultural produce. The railways also had a profound impact on other industries, such as coal and iron. Coal was essential for powering steam engines and heating homes, and the demand for coal increased exponentially as the railways expanded. Iron was needed to build the railways themselves, and the construction of rail tracks, stations, and bridges provided a boost to the iron and steel industries. The increased demand for iron and coal helped to further expand Britain's industrial base, providing opportunities for new businesses to emerge. The financial sector also experienced rapid growth during this period, as banks and financial institutions became more integral to the industrial economy. The availability of capital was crucial to financing the expansion of industry, and the growth of financial institutions facilitated the process. London, as the financial capital of the world, became a hub for international trade and investment. The establishment of new joint stock companies allowed individuals to invest in industrial ventures, further fueling the growth of the economy. The wealth generated by industrialization was not, however, evenly distributed. While industrialists, factory owners, and investors saw vast profits, the working class often lived in squalid conditions, facing long hours and low wages. Nonetheless, the Victorian economy provided new opportunities for entrepreneurship, and the rise of the middle class created a new social and economic dynamic. The wealthy bourgeoisie were able to invest in land, industry, and trade, consolidating their position as the dominant economic force in Britain. Despite the economic prosperity that the Industrial Revolution brought to Britain, it also resulted in significant social and economic inequalities. While the rich grew wealthier, the working class endured harsh and exploitative working conditions, particularly in factories, mines, and mills. The factory system, while efficient, relied on long hours and low wages. Many workers were forced to work 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in dangerous and unsanitary conditions. One of the most disturbing aspects of industrialization was the widespread use of child labor. Children as young as 5 or 6 were employed in factories, mines, and textile mills, where they were subjected to long hours, poor pay, and dangerous working conditions. In textile factories, children worked with machinery that could easily cause severe injuries, while in coal mines they were used to crawl through narrow tunnels, often at great risk to their health. The plight of factory workers, particularly women and children, led to the emergence of labor movements and calls for reform. In response to growing social unrest and the visible suffering of the working class, the government began to implement social reforms aimed at improving working conditions. The Factory Acts, passed between 1833 and 1847, sought to regulate child labor, limit working hours, and improve safety standards in factories. Although these reforms were significant, they were often slow in coming, and working conditions in many industries remained harsh well into the late 19th century. The birth of labor movements and trade unions also played a significant role in the fight for workers' rights. These movements advocated for better wages, working conditions, and shorter hours, and they played a crucial role in the eventual establishment of a welfare state. The Chartist movement, which emerged in the 1830s, called for political reforms, including universal suffrage and the secret ballot, which were seen as essential to securing workers' rights. Although Chartism failed to achieve its immediate goals, it helped to pave the way for later political reforms that would improve the lives of working-class people. The rise of industrialization also led to a shift in the class structure of Victorian society. The industrial economy created a growing divide between the rich and the poor. The wealthy class, which included factory owners, landowners, and businessmen, enjoyed unprecedented wealth and luxury. They lived in opulent mansions and were able to indulge in the consumer culture that was emerging in Britain. The growing availability of mass-produced goods meant that luxury items were more accessible than ever before, and the wealthy were able to indulge in an increasingly consumer-oriented lifestyle. At the same time, the working class faced significant hardships. The expansion of industry created an urban proletariat that lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions in the rapidly growing industrial cities. Many workers lived in slums where they were exposed to poor sanitation, disease, and inadequate housing. The rise of the middle class, on the other hand, brought about a shift in societal values. The Victorian middle class emphasized respectability, thrift, and hard work, values that were reinforced by the economic prosperity generated by industrialization. The industrial economy also had a significant impact on rural life and agriculture. While industrialization was concentrated in urban areas, it had ripple effects in the countryside. The growth of factories and railways meant that rural communities became more integrated into the national economy. The rise of agriculture as an industry, with larger mechanized farms, led to the displacement of many rural laborers, who either moved to the cities in search of work or were forced into lower-paying jobs on farms. This shift also affected the landowning class, which faced increased competition from the growing industrial sector. The Industrial Revolution was a defining moment in Britain's history, bringing about an era of extraordinary economic growth, technological innovation, and social transformation. While it positioned Britain as the leading industrial power in the world, it also introduced significant challenges, particularly for the working class. The rise of factories, the expansion of trade and commerce, and the growth of the railways transformed Britain into a global economic powerhouse. However, the downside of industrialization, harsh working conditions, child labor, and the rise of labor movements, highlighted the social inequalities that came with this transformation. The Victorian class structure became more rigid, with a growing divide between the rich and the poor, and the lives of millions of working-class people were profoundly affected by the industrial economy. Ultimately, the Industrial Revolution was a complex process that brought both prosperity and hardship, reshaping Britain in ways that would have lasting consequences for generations to come. During Queen Victoria's reign, Britain's foreign policy and military engagements played a crucial role in shaping its global influence, imperial expansion, and international relations. As the British Empire expanded to its greatest territorial extent, Queen Victoria, though a constitutional monarch with limited direct political power, became a symbol of British imperial strength. The wars and conflicts during her reign, from the Crimean War to the Boer War, had lasting effects on both the empire and public opinion. The changing dynamics of diplomacy and the complexities of managing an empire stretched across continents were significant challenges for both Queen Victoria and her government. This chapter explores three major conflicts during her reign: the Crimean War, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and the Boer War, as well as the broader challenges of managing foreign policy and diplomacy. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. The Crimean War was a significant military conflict fought between Russia and an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia. It stemmed from several geopolitical tensions, including Russia's expansionist ambitions in the Black Sea region and the delicate balance of power in Europe. One of the primary causes of the war was Russia's desire to protect and expand its influence in the Ottoman Empire's weakening territories, particularly in the Balkans. This brought Russia into direct conflict with Britain and France, who were keen to prevent Russia from gaining more power in the region, as they feared it would upset the balance of power in Europe. The war began in 1853 when Russia invaded the Ottoman territories of Moldavia and Wallachia. Initially, Britain was hesitant to get involved, but as Russian influence continued to spread and threaten the balance of power, Britain decided to support the Ottoman Empire, as well as its French allies. The war's most significant military campaign occurred on the Crimean Peninsula, particularly around the port city of Sevastopol. The British and French forces, together with the Ottomans, laid siege to the Russian stronghold for almost a year. The war also saw the first major use of modern technology in warfare, including the use of railways to transport supplies, the telegraph for communication, and advanced weaponry like rifled artillery. The Crimean War had several outcomes. On the military front, the conflict resulted in the defeat of Russia, which had to retreat from the Black Sea region and sign the Treaty of Paris in 1856. The treaty neutralized the Black Sea, barring both Russia and the Ottoman Empire from maintaining a military presence there. The war also marked a turning point in the way warfare was conducted, introducing new technologies and changing military strategies. It also marked the end of Russian imperial expansion into Europe. For Britain, the Crimean War had a mixed legacy. Though it secured a temporary balance of power in Europe and ensured British naval dominance in the Mediterranean, the war was costly, both financially and in terms of human lives. The British military's performance during the war was criticized, especially after the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade during the Battle of Balaclava in 1854, where British forces suffered heavy casualties due to poor leadership and communication. The war also saw the rise of Florence Nightingale, who became a national hero for her work in improving medical care for soldiers. The war's impact on public opinion in Britain was profound. Although initially popular, the conflict became increasingly unpopular as the horrors of war, such as the heavy losses and poor conditions for soldiers, became more widely known. The war also led to the reform of the British military, with better organization, improvements in medical care, and changes in how wars were reported. Queen Victoria, though she did not directly intervene in military affairs, was deeply affected by the war and the suffering of her soldiers. She maintained a relationship with Florence Nightingale and was emotionally invested in the welfare of the troops, which helped shape her public image as a compassionate monarch. The Indian Rebellion of 1857. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, often referred to as the Indian Mutiny or the First War of Indian Independence, was another major event in Queen Victoria's reign. It began as a mutiny of British East India Company soldiers, known as sepoys, in the town of Meerut, but quickly escalated into a widespread revolt against British rule across northern India. The causes of the rebellion were numerous, including resentment over British economic policies, the annexation of Indian territories, and the cultural insensitivity of the British, particularly regarding religious practices. The immediate spark for the mutiny was the introduction of new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with animal fat, which offended both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, leading to widespread unrest. The rebellion spread rapidly, with Indian rulers, peasants, and soldiers rising up against British authority. Major cities such as Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow fell under the control of Indian rebels. The British East India Company, which had been running much of India's administration, struggled to suppress the uprising. Initially, the British response was slow, but they eventually dispatched reinforcements from Britain and India, leading to a bloody and prolonged conflict. The British forces regained control of most territories by 1858, but the mutiny marked the end of the East India Company's rule and the beginning of direct British rule over India, with the British government taking control of the subcontinent. Queen Victoria's response to the rebellion was crucial in shaping British policy in India. In the aftermath of the rebellion, Queen Victoria issued the Royal Proclamation of 1858, which marked the formal end of the East India Company's rule and the establishment of the British Raj, with Queen Victoria becoming Empress of India. The proclamation promised greater respect for Indian traditions and religions and a more cautious approach to British imperialism, though the reality of British colonial rule did not significantly change in terms of exploitation and governance. The rebellion had a profound impact on British colonial policy, leading to a more centralized and direct form of rule. The British government took steps to strengthen its grip on India, including reorganizing the army, reforming the civil administration, and creating a more rigid system of control. The rebellion also led to a shift in British attitudes toward India, with more emphasis on maintaining order and authority while still attempting to uphold British interests. For Queen Victoria, the rebellion was a traumatic event, as she was personally affected by the violence and the scale of the uprising. Her relationship with India would change significantly after the rebellion, with the title of Empress of India serving as a symbolic expression of British authority in the subcontinent. However, it also marked the beginning of a more cautious and paternalistic approach to British rule in India, even as Britain expanded its imperial reach across the world. The Boer War, 1899–1902. The Second Boer War in South Africa, fought between the British Empire and the two Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, was another significant conflict during Queen Victoria's reign. The causes of the war were rooted in the tensions between the British and the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had established two independent republics in southern Africa. British imperial ambitions in the region, along with the discovery of gold in the Transvaal in the 1880s, fueled tensions between the Boers and the British. The British sought to bring the Boer republics under their control, while the Boers resisted British attempts to dominate their territory. The war began in 1899 when the Boers launched an attack on British-controlled territories. Despite initial Boer successes, the British eventually mounted a more effective military campaign. The war was marked by guerrilla tactics and brutal fighting, as well as atrocities on both sides. The British response to Boer tactics, which included the use of concentration camps to imprison Boer civilians, led to widespread condemnation and further tarnished the image of British imperialism. The war ended in 1902 with the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging, which brought the Boer republics under British control, but granted the Boers a degree of self-government. The Boer War had significant consequences for British society and imperialism. While it ultimately secured British control over South Africa, the war was deeply unpopular in Britain, particularly among the middle and working classes. The war exposed the weaknesses of British military leadership and tactics, leading to calls for military reform. The cost of the war, both in terms of lives lost and financial expenditure, was a blow to the British Empire's standing. It also sparked debates about the ethics of imperialism and the treatment of colonial subjects. For Queen Victoria, the Boer War represented the challenges of maintaining the integrity of the British Empire in an era of rising nationalism and imperial competition. While she remained a symbolic figurehead of imperialism, the war's aftermath marked a shift in the way the British Empire engaged with its colonies. The war highlighted the increasing tensions and complexities of managing an empire that spanned the globe. Queen Victoria's foreign policy was largely conducted through her government and prime ministers, but as a constitutional monarch, she played a significant role in shaping the diplomatic relationships of Britain during her reign. One of the most notable aspects of Victoria's diplomacy was her extensive network of family ties to other European monarchs, earning her the title of the Grandmother of Europe. Victoria's children and grandchildren were married into many of Europe's royal families, forging political alliances and ensuring that Britain had a network of relationships across Europe. This network of royal marriages was a key aspect of Victorian diplomacy and played a role in maintaining peace in Europe, though it also had its limitations in preventing conflict. Victoria's personal influence in foreign policy was often limited, but her diplomatic relationships with European monarchs, particularly in the context of rising nationalism and imperial competition, were significant. She navigated the delicate balance between imperial interests and the demands of European diplomacy, seeking to maintain Britain's status as a global power. The challenges of managing Britain's far-reaching empire and ensuring that Britain remained at the forefront of global politics were constant themes during Victoria's reign. The death of Queen Victoria on January 22, 1901, marked the end of an era in Britain. Having ascended to the throne in 1837, Queen Victoria had ruled for an unprecedented 63 years, overseeing one of the most transformative periods in British history. Her passing ushered in the Edwardian era, a time of significant change and transition for both the monarchy and the British Empire. While the reign of Queen Victoria concluded, her legacy continued to reverberate across British society, politics, culture, and the world. Her death signified the closure of a chapter, not only in the history of the British monarchy, but also in the history of the British Empire. As the longest-reigning monarch at the time, Queen Victoria had come to symbolize an era of stability, industrialization, and imperial expansion. The Victorian era saw Britain become the world's foremost economic and military power, as well as the center of global cultural and intellectual developments. However, with the passing of Queen Victoria, many of the conditions and ideals that had defined the Victorian age were beginning to be questioned and transformed. Queen Victoria's reign was characterized by both remarkable achievements and notable failures. Her legacy is intertwined with the accomplishments and contradictions of the Victorian period, which saw Britain at the height of its global influence, while also grappling with significant social, political, and economic challenges. At its core, the Victorian era was a time of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and imperial expansion. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain's economy and society, with innovations in machinery, transportation, and communication driving unprecedented economic growth. Cities such as London, Manchester, and Liverpool grew exponentially as a result of industrialization, and the working class became an increasingly important part of the social fabric. Yet, this progress was not without its costs. The Victorian era also saw the rise of harsh working conditions, child labor, and significant social inequality. The wealth generated by the empire and industrialization was concentrated in the hands of a few, while the working class and the poor endured difficult and often dangerous lives. One of the most significant legacies of Queen Victoria's reign was the expansion and consolidation of the British Empire. At its height, the empire spanned vast territories across the globe, from India to Africa to the Pacific. The idea of imperialism became synonymous with British identity during the Victorian era. Queen Victoria's title as Empress of India symbolized Britain's dominance over vast swathes of the world. The Victorian era was marked by a sense of British superiority, with many believing that the empire was both a civilizing force and a duty to uphold. However, the darker side of imperialism, including the exploitation of colonies, the destruction of indigenous cultures, and the brutality of colonial wars, became increasingly evident as the 20th century unfolded. On the domestic front, Queen Victoria's reign witnessed the development of a more modern and efficient British society, with advancements in education, social reform, and public health. The Victorian era was marked by the rise of reform movements aimed at improving the lives of the poor, reducing child labor, and expanding access to education. However, these reforms were often slow to materialize and were tempered by the entrenched class system that defined British society. The Victorian emphasis on moral values, particularly the ideals of respectability, modesty, and family, was also central to the era's social fabric. But this moral rigidity often resulted in a stifling atmosphere, particularly for women, who were largely confined to domestic roles and had limited rights. Victorian society was also marked by a strict social hierarchy, with a clear distinction between the upper, middle, and working classes. While the industrial and economic growth of the period allowed for the rise of a more prosperous middle class, the divide between the rich and the poor was stark. Many of the social issues that arose during the Victorian era, such as poverty, inequality, and the exploitation of workers, would continue to shape British society well into the 20th century. Despite its successes in transforming Britain into a global power, the Victorian era was not without its contradictions. The values of hard work, respectability, and moral uprightness were often at odds with the reality of social and economic inequality. The expansion of the British Empire was accompanied by a growing awareness of its injustices and the cost of imperialism. Furthermore, while industrialization brought wealth and progress, it also resulted in environmental degradation and the alienation of workers. The Victorian legacy also includes the intellectual and cultural developments of the period, which continue to shape British society today. The era produced a wealth of literary works that explored the complexities of human nature, society, and morality. Writers such as Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy addressed pressing social issues like poverty, class, and industrialization. The Victorian period was also a time of great scientific and philosophical advancements, with figures such as Charles Darwin challenging traditional beliefs and laying the groundwork for modern science and social theory. The period's emphasis on intellectual achievement and cultural refinement helped establish Britain as a center of intellectual and artistic influence. Yet, despite these remarkable achievements, the Victorian era's ideals were increasingly challenged as the 20th century approached. The moral certainties of the Victorian age were questioned by the social upheavals that accompanied the industrial and technological revolutions. The rise of socialism, feminism, and labor movements indicated a shift in societal attitudes, with calls for greater equality, rights for women, and the reform of the capitalist system. The death of Queen Victoria ushered in the Edwardian era, a time of both continuity and change for Britain. Her son, Edward VII, ascended to the throne and reigned from 1901 to 1910, marking a shift away from the Victorian ideals that had dominated the previous century. The Edwardian era saw the beginning of the decline of Victorian values, with a greater focus on individualism, leisure, and social mobility. The Edwardian period was also characterized by the growing discontent with the established social order, as well as the beginning of the modern political and social movements that would shape the 20th century. Edward VII's reign marked a departure from the rigid, formalized style of Queen Victoria's court. The British Empire, though still vast, began to show signs of strain during the Edwardian period. The tensions that had been brewing in the latter part of the Victorian era would come to a head with the First World War, which shattered the global dominance of the British Empire. The war would mark the beginning of the end for Britain's imperial ambitions and the start of a new world order. The legacy of imperialism and industrialization, central to Queen Victoria's reign, continued to shape the course of British history throughout the 20th century. The British Empire, while still intact at the beginning of the century, began to unravel after World War I. The economic and political consequences of the war weakened Britain's ability to maintain its colonial holdings, and many countries within the empire began to push for independence. The dissolution of the British Empire and the decolonization movement that followed marked a significant shift in global power dynamics. Industrialization, too, had long-lasting effects on Britain. While it had led to economic growth and prosperity in the 19th century, it also left behind social and environmental challenges that would need to be addressed in the 20th century. The rise of consumer culture, while transforming society, also created new problems related to inequality, environmental degradation, and the concentration of wealth. The legacy of Victorian industrialization thus shaped the modern world, for better or for worse. Queen Victoria's reign left an indelible mark on British society, culture, and politics. Her legacy is a complex and multifaceted one, encompassing both the remarkable achievements of the Victorian era and the contradictions that arose from it. The Victorian period was a time of immense progress, but also one of great social and economic inequality. The expansion of the British Empire, while bringing wealth and global influence, also created injustices that would eventually challenge the very foundations of imperialism. The social reforms, scientific advancements, and intellectual achievements of the Victorian era set the stage for the modern world. Yet, the Victorian values of moral certainties, social hierarchy, and imperial domination began to unravel in the early 20th century, as new social movements emerged and the global balance of power shifted. As we reflect on the lasting influence of Queen Victoria and the Victorian era, we see a period of history that continues to resonate today. The legacy of the Victorian period lives on in modern British society, in the ideals of social reform, scientific progress, and cultural achievement. However, the contradictions and limitations of the era also serve as a reminder of the complexities of history and the ways in which ideals and progress must be constantly questioned and redefined. The themes of the Victorian period, imperialism, industrialization, social justice, and cultural change, remain relevant to contemporary discussions of inequality, global power dynamics, and the challenges of modernization. Queen Victoria's reign was indeed the end of an era, but its legacy continues to shape the world we live in today.